In this video, we're going to look at mistakes that students tend to make on test number 1. This is just, in a sense, some random problems. So, if you want to solve an equation with fractions, you need to know how to do this. And students sometimes know that a good thing to do would be to multiply both sides of this by 24. But even when they do that, they multiply the two fractions, but they don't multiply the 6. If you're going to multiply both sides, you got to multiply everything. This one right here, a couple mistakes students will make. One is they'll just say that it's 6 squared minus 2i squared, and that is not correct. To do this, you need to do 6 minus 2i times 6 minus 2i. That's what it means to square something. In addition, your final answer should not have an I squared in it, so be sure the I squared gets turned into a -1. So, this next one here, students just often forget how to do this kind. The trick for this one is you multiply the top and the bottom by what's on the bottom, except you change the sign. So the top and the bottom both get multiplied by 5 plus 4i. If you can't read that, that's 5 plus 4i that you're multiplying by the top and the bottom. I see students do all sorts of things that are very different than that. This next one here, I guess one of the most common mistakes is if they do start it correctly by square rooting, they forget to put plus or minus when they square root that side, and that's going to end up giving you 2 answers because of the plus or minus. This one here, I can't think of any particular mistakes students make, except maybe they look at that and they just don't know how to do it. Since the highest power on the variable is 2, that's a quadratic equation, which means you could use the quadratic formula to solve it. You could complete the square to solve it. You could also use the zero factor method, but that only works as long as when you get everything on one side, it's factorable, and that may or may not be factorable. I don't know. Just glancing at it, I don't know. Okay, this one here. What students maybe most commonly do wrong with this is they realize they need to square everything, but you cannot square everything until you get the square root by itself first. So you got to move that 10 over there. When you move that 10 over, you're going to get square root of 2x equals x minus 4. Then you square everything, and even then, when you square that, you get 2x. Some students will tell me this becomes x squared and this becomes 4 squared. That's not correct. So that's not what you would do. So after you get the square root by itself, you need to square this side also. And when you square that right side, you do what I said over here. You're multiplying x minus 4 times x minus 4 to figure out what goes on that side. I can't think of any particular common mistakes students make with that one. I'm not saying that they get it right all the time, but I can't think of any particular common mistakes. Okay, these two, students don't realize that these are what are called quadratic type equations. And the way you know they are quadratic type equations is because if you take the middle term without its coefficient, that's x squared, and if you take that and then square it, that gives you x to the 4th, and that gives you back the first term. The other one works the same way. If you take the middle term without the coefficient and you square that, that gives you x to the minus 2, and that gives you back the first term. If you have something like that, it's a quadratic type equation. Now, I just want to say one thing so it's clear. Let's say this equation was 3x to the 4th minus 2x squared minus 8 equals 0. If you take the middle term without its coefficient and you square it, you don't get back the first term, but you do get the first term if you ignore the coefficient for a moment. So that still makes it a quadratic type equation because squaring the middle term without its coefficient gives you the first term without its coefficient. And then you have to know how to solve these things. I'm not going to go into all of that right here, but the way you would solve this is you would turn it into a different looking equation, which if you do it the way that I've told you, will make it look like a squared minus 2a minus 8 equals 0. And then you solve that, and students sometimes get this far. They solve that and they get a couple answers. I don't know what the answers are. I'm just going to make them up. Let's pretend the answers are 1 and -5, which I'm sure they're not. But you're not done, because you have to figure out what x is. It doesn't matter what a is. In the end, you have to figure out what x is. And so you got to be sure to figure out how to go to the step where you figure out what x is equal to, which again, I'm not going into detail about that. Just be aware you're not done until you figure out what x is. Okay, absolute values. Absolute values, one of the most common mistakes students make with them, and I'm not even sure they realize what they're doing, they basically treat it as if the absolute value is not there, and then they solve that equation. Well, that's not going to work. If you're ignoring part of it, then you're doing something wrong. You can't just solve 8x plus 6 plus 4 equals 7. You have to do something with the absolute values. Now, when you have absolute values in an equation, that turns it into two separate equations. I'm not going to go into the detail here, but let's say the two equations end up being 2x plus 3 equals 1 and 2x plus 3 equals -1, which is not what we get here. But just as an example, another mistake students make is once they get to this point, they solve this equation, they get the right answer, and they just assume, since this is a -1 instead of a +1, whatever the answer they get for that, the negative of that will be the answer to that, and that's wrong. In other words, let's just pretend for the moment that the answer to this one is x equals 5. Well, then they just assume that the answer to this one will be x equals -5. Don't make that assumption, because it's going to be wrong 99% of the time. Be sure you solve this completely, and you solve this one completely, and get the two answers. So, don't ignore the absolute values. Understand that it splits into two separate equations to solve, and be sure to solve both of them correctly. I don't know that there's really much of a common mistake I see here, but don't forget, if you divide both sides by a negative, which would be the first step, it reverses the inequality sign. Okay, this one here, well, actually, there's a couple common mistakes with that. One mistake is, again, as I said, students just don't know what to do with the absolute values, and so they basically just ignore the fact that they're there, and they do the math without them. Well, that's not going to give you the answer. Secondly, there's a little trick with this particular one. If I do the first step and subtract 8 from both sides, I get that. Now, there's a trick for solving an absolute value when it is less than something, but that trick only works if the thing it's less than is a positive number. Since this absolute value is less than a negative number, we just know, for reasons that you have seen, we just know that an absolute value can never be less than negative. So for this particular one, there's no solution, or what in the homework they might call DNE. Okay, this one is different here. If you subtract 5 from both sides, you're going to get greater than or equal to 3, and then you need to know how to solve that. And I'll just remind you how to solve that. When you have a greater than or equal to absolute value inequality, it splits up into two separate things to solve. One would be 1 minus x over 2 is greater than or equal to 3. The other one would be 1 minus x over 2, and this turns around and becomes less than or equal to, and this becomes a negative. Then you need to be sure you solve each of these separately. Don't assume the answer to this is going to somehow tell you the answer to that. Solve them both separately. Those two separate answers will be your final answer. And when you're solving a greater than or greater than equal to inequality, your answer is going to be a bunch of numbers on one side and a bunch of numbers on the other side separated. It's always going to be two separated groups of answers. One of the most, I guess there's two common mistakes with this one here. Number one is ignoring that it says completing the square. If it says completing the square, you have to use that method and you have to show all the completing the square steps. The other common mistake is that students just don't remember the steps for completing the square. Just to be clear, if on the test there's a completing the square question and you use any other method to solve it, whether you get it right or not, you'll get 0 credit. You have to use that method if that's what it says. Let's see what we got here. Just one thing I will say about this one, a mistake that I see students make is they do something like this. They add 1 to all the parts because they're trying to get that to become a 0. You don't do that. That is not what you do. Focus on the middle of this. Your goal is to do whatever you can to get the middle to turn into just X. When you're done with that, and I don't know the answer here, but when you're done with that, you'll end up with X in the middle. There'll always be a number on the left and there'll always be a number on the right. So maybe it would be -1 is less than X is less than 3. I don't know the real answer. But you're always going to end up with something that looks like that. It's going to have 1, 2, 3 parts to it. If you don't have 3 parts to it, then you've made a mistake. I'm going to skip this because this is just not the time or place, I think, to go into that. Here, solving for n. I can't think necessarily of, I guess one mistake I think I see students make is they multiply both sides by r plus r. They just assume that gets out of the denominator and just leaves the n. That does not work. If you multiply both sides by r plus r, you're going to get a mess. What you actually have to do, not necessarily the first step, but I think it's a good first step, is multiply both sides by the entire denominator. That'll cancel that, and then you go from there and figure out what to do with that. Nothing in particular, I think, to say about this one, except just be careful. Make sure you really have learned how to solve these problems. It is not uncommon for students to come into test number 1 not really knowing how to solve equations with fractions. And how do you know that you know how to do it? Well, maybe you quiz yourself and try problems from the homework or from a quiz or something and see if you really are getting the right answer with no help at all. Okay, a common mistake with this is leaving I squared in the answer. Be sure if I squared is in the answer, you change it to a -1 and then you simplify. A common mistake with the next one is students will maybe do 11x squared equals 55, which is a great first step. And then you're supposed to square root both sides, but don't square root both sides until you get the x squared by itself. In other words, divide by 55, which in this case is going to give you x squared equals 5. Only when the x squared is by itself, then do you square root both sides. This next one here, you would square both sides to get rid of the square root. And one thing students may not remember, and honestly, I consider this a relatively minor point, so I wouldn't worry too much if you forget it. But when you square both sides of an equation, you can get extra answers that don't belong, which are called extraneous solutions. And you have to check them and make sure they don't see if they work or not in the original equation. My comment about that one is pretty much the same as my comment about that one. Make sure you know how to handle equations and inequalities with fractions. Test yourself and see if you really are able to do it with no help. I have really nothing new to say about that one because that is basically the same idea as that one, except I would say simpler because there's no fractions. And be sure you know how to solve equations like this. In other words, you know how to solve equations with multiple different types of variables for one particular variable. Okay, so that is some things that I think are worth knowing before you take the test. I hope you hear what I'm saying. I hope maybe you try some problems and make sure that you learn not to do the things that I'm telling you that students sometimes do. And that is the end of this recording.